The harsh New Mexico sun beat down on Keme's weathered face as he worked the stubborn soil of his isolated homestead. 15 years of solitude had hardened him like the desert floor beneath his boots. The Apache Wars and the betrayals that followed had taught him one bitter lesson. Family meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. His calloused hands gripped the hoe tighter. The nearest town was 20 miles away, exactly how he wanted it. No neighbors, no questions, no reminders of all he'd lost. When the dust cloud appeared on the horizon that afternoon, Keme reached for his rifle. He wasn't expecting visitors. He never did. Could this unexpected arrival be the one to finally break through the walls he'd spent years building? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Keme lowered his rifle slightly but kept it ready as the dust cloud grew larger. Years of solitude had made him cautious, not careless. His fingers brushed against the small medicine pouch hanging from his neck, a last remnant of his heritage, containing sacred items that connected him to a past he both cherished and mourned. Dawn had found him as it always did, rising before the sun to greet the day with ancient Apache prayers his father had taught him. The ritual remained unchanged despite the passing years. A splash of cool water from the well, dried venison for strength, then work until the heat became unbearable. Afternoon would bring mending, arrow-making, and patrolling his boundaries. Evening meant more prayers, a simple meal, and sleep beneath stars that had witnessed his joy and his sorrow. The medicine pouch contained what little remained of that joy, a smooth stone from his childhood stream, a scrap of his mother's wedding blanket, an arrowhead fashioned by his grandfather, and a tiny scrap of cloth from his daughter's dress. He never opened it anymore. The memories were too painful. The ghost. Some called him in whispers when he occasionally ventured into Cimarron Springs for supplies. The name had followed him since his days as an army scout, when he could track a man for days without being detected. Those skills had saved his life during the wars, though they couldn't save what mattered most. Tom Holloway at the general store was the closest thing Keme had to a friend, though acquaintance would be more accurate. Tom respected his silence, never pried, and occasionally passed along warnings about soldiers or troublemakers in the area. In return, Keme sometimes left fresh game on the man's doorstep before dawn. Neither acknowledged these exchanges. The townspeople left him alone, which suited him fine. Some feared him because of old prejudices against Apaches. Others because of the rumors that he'd killed dozens of men, that he could speak to wolves, that he practiced powerful medicine. None approached his land, and that was all that mattered. A gray wolf occasionally appeared at the edge of his property, watching from a distance before disappearing into the hills. Keme left scraps for it sometimes, recognizing a kindred solitary spirit. "We understand each other," he'd murmur in Apache. "No pack, no people. Just survival." His small cabin stood as testament to his determination. Built with his own hands from pine harvested in the nearby hills, it was simple but sturdy. A veranda faced east to greet the morning sun. Inside was Spartan. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, though he never had visitors, a fireplace and shelves holding his few possessions. The extra chair was a concession he couldn't explain, even to himself. On the highest shelf, wrapped in a clean cloth, sat the only photograph he possessed. A tintype of a woman with solemn eyes and a small child. He looked at it only on the anniversary of their deaths, allowing himself that single day of remembrance before locking the grief away for another year. The approaching dust cloud now revealed a single rider on a tired-looking horse. Keme's eyes narrowed. The figure was too small for a soldier, too steady for a drunk prospector. As the distance closed, he realized with surprise that it was a woman. Women never came here alone. His hand instinctively tightened on the rifle again. In his experience, unexpected visitors meant trouble regardless of their sex. The last time the army had visited, they'd brought papers nullifying his land claim, only to discover his original deed was signed by a territorial governor and legally binding. They'd left with threats veiled as warnings about hostiles in the area. The rider stopped at the edge of his cleared land, seemingly aware of the invisible boundary. Smart. She sat straight despite obvious exhaustion, her dress dusty from travel but of good quality. A large cast-iron skillet hung from her saddle, an odd traveling companion. Keme remained motionless on his porch, the rifle visible but not aimed. Let her speak first. Let her reveal her purpose. When she finally broke the silence, her voice carried clearly across the yard, neither timid nor demanding, simply matter of fact. "You need a cook," she called. "I need a home." 8 words that would change everything, though Keme couldn't know that yet. He only knew that something in her direct gaze unsettled him more than any threat could have. She looked at him not with fear or disgust or pity, but with simple recognition, as if seeing past his carefully constructed walls to something he thought long buried. Keme said nothing, his silence a shield as familiar as the medicine pouch against his chest. The woman dismounted with a wince that betrayed days of hard riding. Still, Keme noted the grace in her movements. Not a pampered city woman, despite her speech that carried hints of Eastern education. "I don't need a cook," he finally replied, his voice rough from disuse. "And this isn't a home for sharing." She straightened, brushing dust from her skirt with dignity that seemed at odds with her circumstances. "Mr. Keme." "Mr. Keme, I'm Sarah Miller. I can cook, clean, mend, garden, and keep to myself. I don't require conversation or comforts." Her eyes held his steadily. "Just shelter and safety." Safety. The word hung between them. Keme had been reading newspapers from Cimarron Springs enough to recognize what wasn't being said. A woman traveling alone, seeking safety, meant trouble following. "Your trouble isn't mine," he said flatly. "Town's 20 miles south." Sarah glanced at her exhausted horse. "We both know he won't make another 20 miles today." Keme frowned, looking past her to scan the horizon. No other dust clouds yet. Whatever or whoever she was running from wasn't immediately behind her. His fingers absently touched the faded tintype in his shirt pocket, a habit he developed over the years when making difficult decisions. The photograph was worn at the edges from handling, though he rarely looked at the image itself anymore. The pain was too sharp even after 15 years. His wife Nita's smile frozen in time. Their daughter Itzila, just 3 years old, sitting on her mother's lap. They had been everything to him, his reason for trying to bridge 2 worlds, for scouting for the army while maintaining his Apache ways. That bridge had collapsed the day he returned from a scouting mission to find his home burned, his family gone. The army blamed renegade Apaches. The Apache blamed the army. In the end, it didn't matter who was responsible. They were gone, and with them his heart. "One night," he found himself saying, "in the barn. At dawn you ride for town." Sarah nodded once, accepting his terms without gratitude or protest. Another point in her favor. She gathered her horse's reins and waited for him to indicate the direction. Keme gestured toward a small but well-maintained barn behind the cabin. As she led her horse away, he noticed a slight limp, subtle, like she was trying to hide it. Not his concern, he reminded himself. Inside his cabin, he moved restlessly, and used to having another human presence on his land. Through the window, he watched her efficiently unsaddle her horse, rub it down, and provide water. She moved with the care of someone who respected animals. The sun was setting when she emerged from the barn, the skillet in one hand and a small bundle in the other. She approached the cabin hesitantly, remaining at the foot of the porch steps. "Might I trouble you for water?" she asked. "For washing and cooking." Keme pointed to the well. "Help yourself." He should have gone inside, reinforced the boundaries. Instead, he found himself watching as she drew water, set up a small cooking area near the edge of his porch, and began preparing a meal from her meager supplies. "I have enough to share," she said, not looking up from her work. "As thanks for the shelter." Keme hadn't planned to accept, but the aroma of cornbread cooking in that skillet weakened his resolve. It had been years since he'd eaten food prepared by someone else. As darkness fell, they sat at opposite ends of the porch, the lantern between them casting long shadows. The meal was simple but far better than his usual fare. They ate in silence until she finally spoke. "My husband is looking for me." Keme didn't respond, though her directness surprised him. "He's a businessman in Boston. Respected, wealthy, powerful." Her voice remained calm, but her knuckles whitened around her cup. "He's also the man who gave me this." She pulled back her sleeve to reveal a fading bruise on her wrist, shaped unmistakably like fingerprints. "As I said, I need safety. I can work for it." She met his eyes again. "I don't expect charity." Keme looked away, uncomfortable with her honesty and the unwanted empathy it stirred. "Dawn comes early," he said, standing. "There's water in the bucket if you need more." He retreated into his cabin, closing the door firmly. Through the window, he watched her clean her dishes methodically before returning to the barn. Sleep eluded him that night. The woman's presence disrupted 15 years of careful isolation. Worse, her situation awakened memories of his own helplessness, his own loss. Dawn couldn't come quickly enough. Dawn arrived with unexpected clouds gathering on the horizon. Keme stepped onto his porch, an eagle feather in hand, his father's final gift before the old man died. Each morning, Keme held it up to catch the first light, a private ritual connecting him to his ancestors. "Rain coming," he murmured to himself, feeling the moisture in the air. The feather seemed to vibrate slightly in the changing wind. The barn door opened, and Sarah emerged, her hair neatly pinned despite her night in the hay. She had already drawn water and was heating it over a small fire. "Good morning," she said, her tone respectful but not submissive. "I've prepared coffee, if you'd like some." Keme hadn't enjoyed real coffee in months, rationing his supply from town. The aroma tugged at him, but he remained wary of further entanglements. Before he could respond, a low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. "Storm's coming," he said instead. "Won't make town today." Sarah looked at the darkening sky, then back to him. Her expression remained neutral, but Keme caught the flash of relief in her eyes. "I understand. Perhaps tomorrow." She poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the porch railing nearest him. "In the meantime, I could earn my keep. Your cabin roof has 3 loose shingles on the western side." Keme raised an eyebrow, surprised at her observation. "You climb roofs, Mrs. Miller?" "My father was a carpenter. I was his only child." She sipped her own coffee. "And it's Miss Miller now, by my reckoning." The eagle feather in Keme's hand caught a gust of wind, nearly slipping from his fingers. His father's voice seemed to whisper in the wind. "The Great Spirit sends what we need, not what we want." "Storm might last 2 days," Keme said finally, reaching for the coffee. The first sip was better than he remembered, strong but not bitter. "Mending and food. 2 days shelter for 2 days work. Then you go." Sarah nodded once, accepting the terms. "I'll need supplies from my saddlebag, and perhaps thread, if you have it." By mid-morning, rain fell in sheets. Keme sat at his table repairing a bridle while Sarah worked quietly at the fireplace. Neither spoke much, but the silence was oddly companionable. The cabin, usually so empty, felt different with her efficient movements and the smells of real cooking. "What brought you to New Mexico territory?" Keme asked suddenly, surprising himself as much as her. Sarah looked up from the stew she was preparing. "A train, then a stagecoach, then a horse when roads ran out." A small smile touched her lips. "Unless you meant what circumstances." Keme almost smiled back. Another surprise. "Yes." She stirred the pot thoughtfully. Charles, my husband, has business connections throughout Boston. Judges, police, politicians. When I finally decided to leave, I knew it had to be somewhere beyond his reach. She glanced at him. Few places are farther from Boston society than the New Mexico territory. And you found me by accident? I found you by research. In Santa Fe, I heard stories of an Apache who lived alone near Cimarron Springs. A man who helped travelers in trouble but wanted nothing in return. She checked the cornbread baking in his small oven. People called you the ghost. I thought someone with that reputation might understand discretion. Keme set down the bridle, studying her more carefully. Not a desperate flight, then, but a calculated one. It changed his assessment of her situation and her. Your husband, he's violent beyond the bruises? Sarah's hands stilled momentarily. Charles believes he owns what he pays for, including a wife. Her voice remained steady, but Keme recognized the control it required. The last time I suggested leaving, he locked me in our bedroom for a week. When the servants heard me screaming, he told them I was having female hysteria and required isolation. The rain pounded harder, matching the sudden drumming of anger in Keme's chest. His people had many flaws, but a man who abused his wife would find himself outcast, stripped of honor. 2 days, he repeated, though his tone had softened. Maybe 3 if the canyon floods. Sarah nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. A reprieve. That evening, they ate the best meal Keme had enjoyed in years. The stew was rich with herbs she'd found near the barn, and the cornbread light despite his crude cooking equipment. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked. My mother taught me the basics. The rest I learned after marrying Charles. Servants prepared our meals, but cooking became my sanctuary. A distant look crossed her face. The kitchen was the one place he rarely visited. The rain continued through the night, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. Keme offered Sarah the bed while he took a bedroll near the fire. As he drifted toward sleep, he realized the eagle feather was still in his pocket, warmed from being close to his heart all day. Morning broke with the storms passing, leaving behind a world washed clean. Keme woke to unfamiliar sounds, quiet humming and the sizzle of fat in a pan. For a disorienting moment, he thought he'd somehow traveled back in time, to when Nita would prepare breakfast while singing Apache lullabies. Reality returned as he sat up. Sarah stood at his small stove, her cast iron skillet producing aromas that made his stomach growl audibly. She turned at the sound, a hint of amusement in her eyes. I hope you don't mind, she said. I found eggs in the coop and some bacon in your smokehouse. Keme hadn't fried bacon in months, preferring to eat it dried to make it last longer. You've been busy. I rise early. She slid a perfectly cooked egg onto a plate beside bacon crisped exactly how he liked it, though he couldn't remember telling her his preference. The path to town will be muddy today. Probably difficult for my horse after yesterday's rest. Her observation was accurate but clearly strategic. Keme took the plate, considering. The sensible course was clear: send her on her way. Yet, as he took the first bite of breakfast, he found his resolve weakening. You mentioned mending skills, he said finally. My winter shirts need attention before cold weather. The smile that briefly lit her face seemed genuine, without artifice or calculation. I saw them. The stitching around the collar is coming undone on 2, and 1 is missing buttons. After breakfast, Sarah brought in water from the well and heated it without being asked. As she washed the dishes, Keme checked his property, garden, livestock, fence lines. Everything was in order, though the muddy ground confirmed the road to town would indeed be treacherous. When he returned, Sarah had established a small workspace at one end of the table. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she repaired his shirts, her stitches neat and even. She'd found his button box and selected perfect matches for the missing ones. Where did you sleep before? She asked without looking up from her work. Keme, carving a new axe handle nearby, paused. Before I took your bed. There's only one in the cabin, yet the bedroll seemed temporary. Observant, this woman. I sleep outside most nights, under the stars. Sarah's needle flashed in the sunlight from the window. Even in winter? I have a shelter behind the house for the coldest nights. She digested this information silently, completing her stitching on the first shirt before reaching for the next. You have a good home here. Sturdy. Well-maintained. Keme grunted non-committally, though her recognition of his hard work stirred something in him. Most people saw only crude frontier living in his arrangements, not the careful planning and craftsmanship. They worked in compatible silence until midday, when Sarah rose to prepare a simple meal. Afterward, she disappeared briefly, returning with wild onions and herbs she'd gathered near the creek. For tonight's stew, she explained, sorting them on the table. Your garden is well planned, but lacks seasoning plants. Never saw the need, Keme admitted. Food was sustenance, nothing more. At least that's what he'd told himself for 15 years. In the afternoon, clouds gathered again. Keme frowned at the sky. More rain coming. Canyon Road definitely flooded now. Sarah followed his gaze. How long until it's passable? 3 days, maybe 4. He glanced at her, expecting disappointment. Instead, he caught relief quickly masked by practicality. I should earn my keep for the additional days. Your roof still needs those shingles replaced, and I noticed your flour bin is nearly empty. I can make bread if you have wheat I could grind. Keme studied her for a long moment. Why cooking? Why come to a stranger offering that skill above all others? Sarah's hands stilled on the herbs. Because everyone must eat, she said simply. And when you prepare someone's food, you become necessary, not just tolerated. The honesty in her answer resonated uncomfortably. Had he not been thinking of her breakfast when he allowed her to stay? Later, as the promised rain began falling, they ate dinner by lamplight. The stew, enriched with Sarah's foraged additions, filled the cabin with savory aromas. Keme found himself taking second helpings, then thirds. Tomorrow, he said as she collected their empty bowls, I'll show you where the wheat is stored, and perhaps where the roof needs mending. Sarah looked up, surprise briefly visible before she composed her features. I'd appreciate learning the layout of your homestead, to work more efficiently, she added. That night, listening to the rain on the roof, Keme realized he'd just invited her to stay indefinitely. The thought should have alarmed him more than it did. Instead, he found himself wondering what breakfast might bring. A week passed. Then another. The rains came and went, but Sarah remained. Each morning, Keme expected to wake and find her preparing to leave. Each evening, he found reasons not to mention the improved road conditions. Their routine developed naturally. Mornings began with breakfast prepared by Sarah, followed by shared work around the homestead. Afternoons found them attending to separate tasks. Keme hunting or repairing equipment, Sarah tending the garden she'd expanded or preserving food for the coming winter. Evenings brought them together again for meals and quiet companionship. They spoke little of personal matters after that first night. Keme appreciated Sarah's respect for his privacy, though he occasionally caught her looking at his Medici, any pouch with curiosity when she thought he wasn't watching. One evening, Sarah was unusually quiet during dinner. Afterward, she retrieved a small wooden box from her few possessions and placed it on the table between them. My mother's, she said softly. A music box from Vienna. The box was finely crafted, inlaid with mother-of-pearl in a floral pattern. Keme admired the workmanship but didn't touch it. It played her favorite melody when I was a child. Sarah's fingers traced the inlay. I would fall asleep to it every night. It doesn't play now? Keme asked when she didn't continue. Sarah shook her head. Charles broke it during one of his episodes. Kept it anyway. Silly, perhaps. Not silly, Keme said, thinking of his own preserved memories. Some things carry spirit beyond their function. Something in his words made her look up sharply. Yes, exactly. A moment of silence stretched between them before she added, It's the only thing I have from before Charles. Keme understood what she wasn't saying. This wasn't just a broken trinket. It was evidence of what her marriage had cost her. He surprised himself by asking, May I? And reaching for the box. Sarah handed it to him carefully. Keme examined it with the same attention he gave to his rifles and tools, fingers finding the damaged mechanism inside. Spring is bent, not broken, he murmured. Might be fixable. The hope that flickered across Sarah's face made something shift in Keme's chest. Truly. No promises, he cautioned, setting the box aside. But I'll try. They were interrupted by the sound of an approaching horse. Keme was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. Stay inside, he ordered quietly, moving to the window. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly when he recognized Tom Holloway's sturdy form dismounting outside. Still, the storekeeper never came this far without reason. Evening, Keme, Tom called, remaining respectfully by his horse. Hope I'm not intruding. Keme stepped onto the porch, keeping his rifle visible but lowered. Something wrong in town? Not exactly wrong, Tom hedged, then noticed Sarah's silhouette in the doorway. He removed his hat. Ma'am. Tom Holloway from Cimarron Springs. Sarah Miller, she responded with a polite nod, staying in the doorway. Tom's eyebrows rose slightly at her refined accent, but he continued addressing Keme. Thought you should know, there's a fella been asking questions. Expensively dressed. Eastern man with hired guns. Keme felt Sarah stiffen behind him. What kind of questions? About a woman. Boston accent. Well-educated. Tom's eyes flicked to Sarah briefly. Offering good money for information. Town talking? Keme asked bluntly. Tom shook his head. Not much. Folks around here mind their business. But. He's staying at Judge Parker's house. Old connections, apparently. Tom replaced his hat. Judge has influence. Might convince the sheriff to organize a search of outlying homesteads if pressed. The implications hung in the air. Keme nodded once. Appreciated, Tom. The storekeeper mounted his horse, then hesitated. My sister runs a boarding house in Santa Fe. Respectable place. If anyone needed somewhere discreet. I'll remember, Keme said. After Tom departed, Keme turned to find Sarah pale but composed. He's found me faster than I expected, she said quietly. You need to go, Keme stated, though the words felt strangely unwelcome on his tongue. Santa Fe, then further west. Sarah's chin lifted slightly. And if I'm tired of running? Then you're tired of living, Keme replied bluntly. Men like your husband don't stop. Men like my husband expect women to run, she countered. They don't expect them to stand their ground. Keme studied her face, the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. This isn't your ground to stand on, isn't it? Sarah asked softly. Where else have I been allowed to be myself in the past 5 years? Where else have I slept without fear? The simple truth of her words left Keme without response. That night, long after Sarah had gone to bed, he sat on the porch with the broken music box in his hands, working on its delicate mechanism by lamplight and considering paths he'd thought forever closed to him. A month passed with no further word about Sarah's husband. The summer heat gradually yielded to crisp autumn mornings as the land prepared for its annual slumber. Sarah remained, their temporary arrangement never discussed again, but silently extended through daily routines and shared work. The cabin had transformed under her care. Keme's Spartan quarters now featured curtains made from flour sacks, a braided rug before the fireplace, and shelves reorganized for efficiency. She'd created small touches of beauty in unexpected places, a cluster of dried wildflowers on the table, stones arranged by color on the windowsill, his tools hanging in perfect order on the wall. Most surprising was his reaction to these changes. Instead of feeling invaded, Keme found himself appreciating the thoughtfulness behind each modification. The curtains blocked the early morning sun that once woke him too early. The rug warmed the floor on cool mornings. Even the flowers pleased him, though he'd never admit it aloud. One evening, after a particularly satisfying dinner of venison stew from a deer Keme had shot that morning, he disappeared into the storage lean-to attached to the cabin. Sarah cleaned the dishes, humming softly to herself, a habit that had initially irritated him but now signaled comfortable routine. He returned carrying a hand-carved wooden box, placing it on the table between them. "What's this?" Sarah asked, drying her hands on her apron. Keme opened the lid to reveal a chess set, each piece intricately carved from different woods, the board built into the box itself. "You carve these?" Sarah asked, gently touching a knight with an Apache-styled headdress. Keme nodded. "Winter nights are long. Keeps the hands busy." "It's beautiful work," she said with genuine admiration. "I've never seen pieces like these. White pieces are cavalry soldiers, officers, missionaries. Black are Apache warriors, chiefs, medicine men." Keme arranged the pieces in their starting positions. "Game is the same. You're suggesting we play?" Sarah asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Unless you don't know how." A small smile touched her lips. "My father taught me. Though I warn you, he was quite good." They settled on opposite sides of the table, the lamplight casting warm shadows across the board. Sarah played carefully at first, clearly rusty but remembering the moves. Keme watched her face more than the board, noting the small furrow between her brows when she concentrated, the flash of satisfaction when she made a good move. "Charles never approved of chess," she said after capturing one of. Throughout each interaction, he positioned himself to keep Sarah partially shielded from street view without being obvious about it. Their final errand took them to the small dry goods store for winter boots. As Sarah tried on pairs, the shopkeeper's wife leaned closer to her. "You're staying with the Apache then?" she asked in a hushed tone that carried a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I am," Sarah replied evenly, meeting the woman's gaze. "Bold choice," the woman commented. "Though they say he's different from others of his kind. Keeps to himself. Never causes trouble." "He's a good man," Sarah said with quiet certainty that made Keme, standing nearby, look away to hide his reaction. As they loaded their supplies and prepared to leave town, Keme noticed the watcher had disappeared from his post. The hairs on his neck rose in warning. "Time to go," he said softly to Sarah. "We're being followed." They took a circuitous route home, Keme leading them through shallow streams and rocky terrain to confuse their trail. Sarah followed without question, trusting his expertise. The sun was setting by the time they circled back toward the homestead, approaching from the eastern ridge rather than the main trail. "Will they find us?" Sarah asked as they unsaddled the horses in the barn. Keme considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Not tonight. Tomorrow depends on their tracking skills." Inside the cabin, Sarah moved with unusual nervousness, her earlier composure fraying. "I've brought danger to your door," she said as she unpacked their supplies. "I'm sorry for that." Keme lit the lamps and built up the fire against the evening chill. "My door has seen danger before." He retrieved a leather-bound book from a shelf and placed it on the table between them. The cover was worn smooth from handling, the pages inside filled with precise drawings of landscapes, detailed maps, and notes in both English and Apache. "My scout ledger," he explained, opening to a map of the surrounding territory. "From when I guided for the army." Sarah leaned forward, studying the intricate details. "You made these? They're remarkable." Keme shrugged off the compliment but felt a flicker of pride nonetheless. "Need to know the land to survive it." His finger traced a route through the mountains. Here, a hunting cabin 2 hours' ride. Hidden in a box canyon. You're suggesting I hide there? Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. I'm suggesting options, Keme corrected. Your husband's man saw you today. Decision is yours what happens next. Sarah's fingers brushed against the map, following the contours of streams and ridgelines. You were a scout during the Apache Wars? Fighting against your own people. The question might have angered him from someone else, but her tone held no judgment, only curiosity. I guided, translated, negotiated when possible. Keme closed the ledger. Thought I was building a bridge between worlds. Building peace. What happened? Keme's jaw tightened. Army commander used my information to find a peaceful camp. Women, children, elders. I was away, scouting another area. The familiar pain rose in his chest. When I returned, my family was gone. Commander said renegade Apaches attacked. Apache survivors said bluecoats came at dawn. You never learned the truth? Truth was in the graves. Keme stared into the fire. I buried my wife, my daughter, left the army, left the tribe. Truth didn't matter anymore. Sarah's hand moved toward his on the table but stopped short of touching. It still matters to you, she said softly. That's why you live here, between both worlds and part of neither. Her perception unsettled him. Few people looked beyond the Apache ghost to the man beneath, and none had named his isolation so accurately. The moment stretched between them until Sarah finally spoke again. I won't run to the hunting cabin. Not yet. Her voice strengthened with resolve. This is the first place in years I've felt myself. I won't surrender that easily. Keme nodded, understanding better than she knew. Then we prepare. They spent the evening planning, securing windows, positioning weapons within easy reach, establishing signals and escape routes if needed. Keme was impressed by Sarah's practical questions and suggestions. Her hands might be those of a Boston lady, but her mind was sharp as any warrior's. Later, as Sarah slept, Keme sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the moonlit landscape. The gray wolf that occasionally patrolled his boundaries appeared at the forest edge, watching the homestead with intelligent eyes. Greetings, brother, Keme murmured in Apache. We have troubles coming. The wolf's ears flicked forward as if listening, then it melted back into the shadows. Morning brought no sign of pursuers, but Keme remained vigilant. He showed Sarah how to use the rifle. She already knew the basics, another surprise, and marked out sight lines and distances around the property. 3 months ago, I couldn't load a rifle without shaking, Sarah admitted as she practiced aiming at a distant tree. Charles believed women shouldn't handle firearms, said our temperaments were too volatile. Many warriors fear arming those they oppress, Keme observed. Sarah lowered the rifle, a sad smile touching her lips. Is that what he was? Not a husband, but an enemy. Man who causes fear in his home is no husband, Keme stated with certainty. Apache men who abuse women are cast out, stripped of honor. A wise custom, Sarah said quietly. In Boston society, such men are often celebrated, their wives pitted for being difficult. As they walked back to the cabin, Sarah paused to examine the vegetable garden she'd expanded since her arrival. Root vegetables were nearly ready for harvest, the soil carefully mounded around each plant. I never expected to plant a garden again, she said almost to herself. It feels like putting down roots. The double meaning hung in the air between them, acknowledged but not discussed as they returned to the day's work. Together 6 months passed. Winter descended with its harsh beauty, then reluctantly gave way to spring's tentative green. The expected confrontation with Charles Miller's men never materialized, perhaps deterred by Keme's reputation, perhaps waiting for a more opportune moment. Regardless, the initial fear had evolved into cautious routine. Their evenings now centered around the chessboard, each game accompanied by increasingly personal conversations. What had begun as necessity had transformed into something neither could name but both had come to cherish. "Check," Sarah said, moving her knight with a small smile of satisfaction. She'd become a formidable opponent, her natural strategic thinking sharpened by nightly practice. Keme studied the board, noting the trap she'd laid 3 moves earlier that he'd walked directly into. "Clever," he acknowledged. "I had a good teacher." Sarah rose to pour them both tea, a small luxury from their last trip to town. As she handed him the cup, her fingers brushed his deliberately. These small touches had been occurring more frequently. A hand on a shoulder when passing, fingers meeting when sharing tools, standing closer than necessary when working together. Neither acknowledged this evolution aloud, but both were acutely aware of it. Near the fireplace sat a small wooden desk Keme had built for Sarah during the winter. On it lay her journal, leather-bound, with handmade paper purchased from a traveling peddler. Each night before bed, she wrote in it by lamplight, though she never offered to share its contents, and Keme never asked. Their peaceful evening was interrupted by a knock at the door, a rare occurrence that immediately put both on alert. Keme motioned for Sarah to move to the bedroom while he retrieved his rifle. "Who's there?" he called. "Tom Holloway," came the reply, "alone and in need of help." Keme opened the door cautiously to find the storekeeper pale and sweating, clutching his arm where blood seeped through a makeshift bandage. "Bear," Tom explained through gritted teeth. "On the North Trail. Got away, but not before it expressed its displeasure." Sarah appeared from the bedroom, immediately assessing the situation. "Bring him in. I'll heat water." As she gathered supplies, Keme helped Tom to a chair. "Lucky. Could have killed you." "Wasn't feeling particularly lucky when those claws connected," Tom grimaced. "But I take your point." Sarah worked efficiently, cleaning and bandaging the wound with skilled hands. When Keme raised a questioning eyebrow, she explained, "I volunteered at a charity hospital in Boston before Charles decided it was beneath his wife's dignity." Tom's eyes, glazed with pain, moved between them. "You two seem settled." Neither responded directly to his observation. After the wound was dressed, Keme insisted Tom stay the night rather than risk the journey back to town. The storekeeper didn't argue, accepting the bedroll near the fire while Keme took watch on the porch. Sarah joined him later, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the spring night's chill. "He'll need a doctor to check for infection," she said quietly. Keme nodded. "I'll take him to town tomorrow." They sat in companionable silence, watching stars emerge above the mountains. Finally, Sarah spoke the words that had been unspoken between them for months. "I'm not leaving, am I?" It was phrased as a question but carried the weight of a decision already made. Keme turned to study her face in the moonlight. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. "No." Her answer came without hesitation. "But I never asked if you wanted me to stay." "Not properly." Keme looked back toward the stars, finding it easier to speak honestly without meeting her eyes. "At first, I thought you would go when the weather cleared. Then I thought you would go when your husband's men came looking. Then, she prompted softly when he didn't continue. "Then I stopped thinking about you leaving," he admitted. Sarah's hand found his on the porch railing, her fingers cool against his skin. "I stopped thinking about leaving." The simple statement altered something fundamental between them. Keme turned his hand to clasp hers properly, the gesture more intimate than any words. 2 days later, Keme returned from taking Tom to town with troubling news. Sarah was tending the garden when he arrived, her face lighting with a smile that quickly faded when she saw his expression. "What's happened?" she asked, brushing soil from her hands. "Your husband is coming himself," Keme said without preamble. Tom heard it from a telegraph operator. "Charles Miller left Boston 2 weeks ago, traveling west." Sarah paled but squared her shoulders. "How long?" "Week, maybe less." That evening, Keme developed a fever, the result of a small wound from repairing fences that had gone unnoticed and become infected. By midnight, he was delirious, his temperature dangerously high. Sarah worked through the night, applying cool compresses and herbal poultices she'd learned to make from Keme's own teachings. She whispered reassurances as he thrashed, caught in fever dreams where past and present blurred. "Nita," he called once, reaching for someone only he could see. "Atsila." Sarah froze, recognizing the names he'd never spoken to her. His wife and daughter. She continued her ministrations with renewed determination, refusing to lose another person she cared for. By dawn, his fever had broken. Keme woke to find Sarah asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still resting on his arm. On the bedside table, he noticed something that hadn't been there before, the tintype photograph of his first family, carefully placed in a small frame Sarah had fashioned from twisted willow branches. When Keme fully regained his senses, he found the tintype of Nita and Atsila displayed openly for the first time in 15 years. His initial reaction was anger, at the invasion of his privacy, at being forced to confront the grief he'd carefully contained. "You had no right," he said when Sarah returned with broth. She met his gaze steadily, unintimidated by his anger. "No, I didn't. But they had no right to be hidden away either." She set the broth beside him. "They were your family. They deserve to be remembered, not buried." Keme looked away, unable to maintain his anger in the face of her quiet certainty. "It's painful." "Yes," Sarah agreed simply. "Love always is, in the end. That doesn't mean it wasn't worth having." After she left, Keme studied the photograph he'd avoided looking at directly for so long. Nita's serene strength, Atsila's mischievous smile, frozen in time but suddenly more vivid than they'd been in years. Sarah had placed the frame on a small shelf she'd created, decorated with a few pine cones and a hawk feather. A memorial, he realized, not hidden away in shame or grief, but honored. By the next day, Keme was well enough to leave bed, though Sarah insisted he rest. She brought him newspapers from town, an excuse for him to practice the reading skills she'd been helping him improve over the winter months. "This article mentions Boston," he said, pointing to a headline about railroad investments. Sarah glanced at it, then returned to mending one of his shirts. "I doubt it's relevant to us." The word hung between them, simple but profound. "This is our home now," Keme said, the statement somewhere between question and declaration. "Not just mine." Sarah's hands stilled on her work. From her pocket, she withdrew a silver hairbrush, the one luxury item she'd kept from her previous life. Its handle was inlaid with mother-of-pearl, the bristles worn but well-maintained. "I've had this since I was 16, she said, turning it in her hands. "My father gave it to me. Kept it hidden from Charles after he broke the music box. It was my reminder that I was once Sarah Blackwood, not just Mrs. Charles Miller." She placed it on the table. "But lately, I've been thinking of selling it." "Why?" Keme asked, surprised by the suggestion. "To buy apple saplings," Sarah answered with a small smile. "For an orchard on the western slope, where the soil is good and they'd be protected from the worst winds. An orchard, a decade-long investment in this place, in their future here." "The brush was your past," Keme observed, "and I've been holding on to it, just as you've been hiding away your family's photograph." Sarah met his eyes directly. "Perhaps it's time we both decided what to keep and what to leave behind." As his strength returned, they began preparing for Charles Miller's arrival. Keme taught Sarah more about using the rifle, impressed by her determination despite her initial fear of the weapon. She proved to be a quick study, her aim improving daily. "In Boston, we had a cook, 2 housemaids, a butler, and a gardener," Sarah remarked one evening as they cleaned and oiled the firearms. "Charles enjoyed reminding me how fortunate I was, how many women would envy my position." Keme listened silently, letting her speak at her own pace. "I tried, you know." to be the wife he wanted. I hosted dinner parties, wore the right clothes, supported his business connections. Her hands moved methodically over the rifle barrel. But I made mistakes, expressed opinions, asked questions about his business dealings. Each transgression earned punishment, subtle at first, then less so. She set the rifle down carefully. The day I decided to leave, he struck me in front of a servant for suggesting he reconsider investing in a railroad scheme that seemed questionable. Later, he apologized not to me, but to the servant for having to witness such an unseemly display. Keme found himself reaching for her hand, surprising them both with the gesture. Here you speak your mind. Always. Sarah's fingers tightened around his. Yes, that's why I can't leave, even if it means facing Charles. The next morning, Keme found Sarah outside, watching the gray wolf that had become a regular presence on their property. Over the months, the animal had gradually decreased its distance, now sometimes coming within 30 yards of the cabin. He's been here 3 days in a row, Sarah noted as Keme joined her. Usually, he only appears every week or so. He senses change coming, Keme said. In Apache tradition, wolves were messengers, sometimes warnings. Will you teach me to say hello to him in Apache? Sarah asked. The request was unexpected but welcome. Keme had occasionally used his native language around her, but had never offered to teach her, unsure if she would be interested. Dagati'i, he pronounced carefully. It means hello, but also, I acknowledge you with respect. Sarah repeated the word, her pronunciation careful but recognizably correct. The wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound of their voices. Dagati, she said again, this time directing it toward the wolf. The animal watched them for a long moment before turning and loping away into the trees. He'll be back, Keme assured her. Sarah nodded. I know. He belongs here now. As do I. Winter arrived earlier than expected, with the first heavy snow blanketing the homestead before November's end. The white expanse transformed their world, creating both beauty and isolation. While the snow might delay Charles Miller's arrival, it also cut them off from town and potential allies. Their days took on a new rhythm. Mornings began with Keme clearing paths to the barn and well, while Sarah prepared hearty breakfasts to fortify them against the cold. Afternoons found them working on indoor projects. Keme carving new chess pieces and repairing tools, Sarah sowing and preserving the last of their fall harvest. Evenings were different. The early darkness and bitter cold outside made their small cabin feel like the only warm place in the world. Their chess games continued, but now they sat closer, sometimes with shoulders touching. Their conversations deepened, no longer careful exchanges but genuine sharing of thoughts, dreams, and fears. One snowy evening, Sarah presented Keme with a surprise. A handmade quilt she'd been secretly working on for weeks. For you, she said somewhat shyly. For when you insist on sleeping by the fire instead of sharing the bed. The quilt was a masterpiece of resourcefulness. She'd salvaged fabric from worn clothing, flour sacks, and trading blankets, arranging the pieces in a pattern that mimicked the mountains visible from their homestead. Apache-inspired geometric designs bordered the edges, clearly influenced by the patterns Keme had shown her in his tribal artwork. You made this? For me? Keme asked, running his hand over the intricate stitching. Sarah nodded. I've never made a quilt before. My mother tried to teach me, but I was more interested in my father's woodshop. She smiled at the memory. I hope it's adequate. It's beautiful, Keme said with genuine appreciation. He recognized the hours of work represented in each careful stitch, the thoughtfulness behind the design. Thank you. That night, wrapped in Sarah's quilt, Keme found himself thinking about the approaching Christmas season. He'd never celebrated the holiday, even during his time with the army. But Sarah had mentioned traditions from her childhood, decorating with evergreen boughs, exchanging simple gifts, special meals shared with loved ones. Loved ones. The phrase echoed in his mind as he drifted toward sleep. The following week, while Sarah was busy making soap from rendered fat and lye, Keme slipped away to the forest. He returned with pine boughs and red berries, arranging them on the mantel above the fireplace. When Sarah emerged from her soap-making, her surprise and delight made the effort worthwhile. "It's perfect," she said, eyes bright with unexpected tears. "Just like my mother used to do." "Christmas is important to you," Keme observed. "Not the day itself, but what it represents. Family, belonging." Sarah touched the pine needles gently. "Even in my worst years with Charles, I tried to create some beauty during this season." That evening, as they sat before the fire, Sarah moved her chair closer to Keme's than usual. The warmth between them wasn't just from the flames. "What did the Apaches do for winter celebrations?" she asked. "Winter solstice," Keme replied. "The longest night. We would keep a fire burning until dawn, tell stories of ancestors, prepare for the sun's return." "Will you teach me one of the stories?" Sarah asked. Keme hesitated only briefly before sharing a creation myth his grandmother had taught him. How Coyote helped create the Milky Way by tossing stars across the sky. As he spoke in the firelight, he felt a connection to his past that wasn't solely painful for the first time in years. When he finished, Sarah was watching him with a softness in her expression he hadn't seen before. "Thank you for sharing that with me." Their eyes held for a long moment. Keme found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something powerful and undeniable. Sarah's breath caught as she moved to meet him. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Both froze, instantly alert. Keme reached for his rifle while Sarah moved silently toward the bedroom where the second weapon was kept. "No one should be visiting in this weather after dark." "Keme? It's Tom Holloway. Urgent news." They exchanged glances. Keme approached the door cautiously, rifle ready, while Sarah covered him from the shadows. Tom's face was grim when Keme opened the door. "Sorry to intrude," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "But you needed to know immediately. He's here." "Charles Miller?" Sarah asked, stepping forward with the second rifle still in hand. Tom nodded. "Arrived yesterday with 4 men. Staying at Judge Parker's again." He looked between them, noting their proximity and the holiday decorations. "There's more." He brought legal papers. A commitment order for his mentally unstable wife and a warrant for the arrest of anyone harboring her. "The sheriff agreed to this?" Keme asked, anger edging his voice. "Sheriff's in a difficult position. Judge Parker has influence and Miller has money." Tom removed his hat, revealing his concern. "But that's not why I came tonight." Miller's men were asking specific questions about this homestead. "Someone's talked." Sarah's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "How long do we have?" "They'll wait for better weather," Tom assessed. 2 days, maybe 3 if the snow continues." As Tom departed with promises to return if he learned more, Keme secured the door and windows. When he turned, Sarah was standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the quilt she'd made him. "We need a plan," she said quietly. "Not for running, for standing our ground." The solution came to Keme in the cold light of dawn after a night of strategic planning. "Marry me," he said without preamble as Sarah poured their morning coffee. The cup in her hand froze midair. "What?" "Legal protection," Keme explained pragmatically. "Your husband can't claim you if you're legally married to another." Sarah set the coffee pot down carefully. "You're proposing marriage as a tactical maneuver?" "Yes." Keme met her eyes directly. "Unless you object." A complex series of emotions crossed Sarah's face. Surprise, consideration, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. "I don't object to the strategy," she said carefully. "But marriage is more than legal protection, Keme." "I know." He looked away, suddenly uncertain. "If you prefer another solution." "I didn't say that." Sarah's voice was soft but steady. I just want to be clear about what we're doing and why. Keme nodded once. Protection, yes. But also, he struggled to find words for feelings he'd denied for so long. Also because this is your home now. Our home. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Yes, she finally said. I'll marry you. They rode to town that morning, the snow having melted enough to make travel difficult but possible. The cold kept most people indoors, allowing them to reach the small church without notice. The elderly minister was surprised by their request but agreed to perform the ceremony immediately. Standing before the simple altar, Sarah wore her best dress. Dark blue wool with a lace collar she'd added herself. Keme had donned a clean shirt and the black vest he wore only for rare formal occasions. Neither had planned for wedding rings, but Keme produced 2 gold coins he'd kept from his army days. The blacksmith, he suggested. He could melt these. Within an hour, they wore simple gold bands, Sarah's slightly smaller but otherwise matching Keme's. The minister's wife and the blacksmith served as witnesses, their expressions a mixture of surprise and cautious approval. Do you have a place to register the marriage? Keme asked the minister, understanding the legal documentation was crucial to their plan. I'll take it to the county clerk myself, the minister assured them. It will be official before sundown. As they prepared to leave town, Tom Holloway intercepted them, pulling them into the relative privacy of his store's back room. Miller's been asking about you specifically, he told Sarah, showing your photograph around town, offering rewards for information. We're married, Sarah informed him, holding up her hand to display the ring. Legally, as of this morning. Tom's eyebrows rose. Well, now that changes things. He thought for a moment. Miller won't take this well, but it complicates his claim considerably. That's the intention, Keme confirmed. As they rode home, Sarah was uncharacteristically quiet. The gold band caught the winter sunlight occasionally, drawing her gaze. Second thoughts? Keme asked. No, she answered quickly. Just wondering what happens after. After Charles accepts defeat and leaves. Sarah adjusted her scarf against the cold. What will this marriage be then? Still a legal arrangement? Or something else? Keme had been avoiding this question himself. What do you want it to be? Sarah reined her horse to a stop, turning to face him fully. I want it to be real, she said with characteristic directness. I didn't realize how much until today. Something tight in Keme's chest loosened at her words. For me as well, he admitted. But I didn't want to assume. The kiss that followed was their first, tentative at first, then deepening with the acknowledgement of feelings long held in check. When they finally separated, Sarah's cheeks were flushed from more than just the cold. That night, their first as husband and wife, brought necessary but awkward adjustments. The single bedroom suddenly presented a question they hadn't fully considered in their strategic planning. I can sleep by the fire, Keme offered, still unsure of Sarah's expectations. She shook her head. It's cold, and you're my husband now. A small smile touched her lips. But perhaps we could simply sleep tonight? Just sleep. The intimacy of sharing a bed was both strange and comforting. They lay side by side, not touching at first, then gradually relaxing as the night deepened. By morning, they had gravitated toward each other's warmth, waking to find themselves wrapped in a comfortable embrace. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Sarah's sister in Philadelphia, carried by a passing trader who'd been paid handsomely for the delivery. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. My sister hasn't written in months, she explained. She must have significant news to risk sending a letter. Keme watched as Sarah's expression changed from curiosity to alarm. Charles is coming himself, she read aloud. With legal papers to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to an asylum. She looked up, face pale. He's also bringing documentation claiming you're holding me against my will. The marriage certificate counters that, Keme pointed out. My sister warns that won't stop him. He's determined to bring me back to Boston, by force if necessary. Sarah's voice steadied with anger. He considers me his property, not his wife. That evening, as they strategized their response to this threat, a sound from the barn caught Keme's attention. Moving silently to the window, he glimpsed figures moving in the shadows. "They're here," he whispered, reaching for his rifle. Earlier than expected, the figures in the barn turned out to be Tom Holloway and his nephew, arriving with warnings and supplies rather than threats. Charles Miller and his men were a day behind them, having been delayed by difficult terrain and an unexpected snowfall in the pass. "He's hired local guides this time," Tom informed them grimly. "Men who know these mountains." They spent the night reinforcing the cabin, positioning weapons, and planning escape routes. By dawn, Sarah had packed essential supplies they could grab quickly if retreat became necessary. While searching the storage shed for additional ammunition, Sarah discovered something unexpected. A small wooden cradle, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind stacked crates. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the wood polished smooth by years of handling. Apache symbols were delicately carved along the sides, protective totems for a child long gone. When Keme found her, Sarah was sitting beside the cradle, one hand resting gently on its curved edge. "It was at Sela's," he said quietly from the doorway. Sarah nodded, not looking up. "I thought so. It's beautiful. I should have burned it after." Keme's voice trailed off. "But I couldn't." "Of course you couldn't." Sarah finally turned to him. "She was your daughter. This was part of her." Keme entered the shed, kneeling beside the cradle. His fingers traced the symbols he'd carved so many years ago. For protection, for long life, for happiness. Dreams he'd once had for his child. "There's something I never told you," Sarah said after a long silence, "about why my marriage truly failed." Keme waited, sensing her need to speak at her own pace. Charles wanted an heir, a son to carry on the Miller name and fortune. Her voice remained steady, but her hands tightened on the cradle's edge. "When I didn't conceive after 2 years, he brought doctors to examine me. They found scarring, the result of a childhood illness. I would never bear children." She met Keme's eyes directly. "That's when the abuse began in earnest. He couldn't divorce me without scandal, but he made sure I understood my failure daily." "Not your failure," Keme said firmly. "Never that. I know that now." Sarah looked back at the cradle. "But I carried the shame for years. I didn't tell you because—" She hesitated. "Because I feared it might matter to you as well." The vulnerability in her admission struck Keme deeply. "Family is more than blood," he said. "My people have always known this. Children without parents were taken in. Adults without children became aunts and uncles to those who needed them." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "And us? What are we now, Keme?" "Family," he answered simply, taking her hand. "Whatever comes next, we face it as family." The moment was interrupted by Tom's urgent call from outside. Riders approaching. At least 6 men. They hurried back to the cabin, where Tom and his nephew had positioned themselves at windows with rifles ready. Keme guided Sarah to the rear window, handing her the second rifle. "Remember what I taught you," he said. "Aim for the center. Breathe before you pull the trigger." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute despite her fear. "I won't let him take me back. I'd rather die here, free, than live in a gilded cage or an asylum." Keme touched her cheek briefly. "It won't come to that." The approaching riders came into view, Charles Miller at the front, flanked by 4 armed men who looked more like mercenaries than legal representatives. A 6th man in a sheriff's badge rode slightly behind them, his expression uncomfortable. "That's Charles," Sarah confirmed, her voice tight. The man to his right is his personal secretary, Edgar. The others I don't recognize. Keme studied their adversaries with a scout's trained eye. The hired guns were professionals, their weapons well-maintained, their posture alert. The secretary looked out of place in the wilderness but determined nonetheless. Charles Miller himself sat his horse with the arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way. Only the sheriff seemed reluctant, hanging back as if hoping to avoid direct confrontation. "Tom," Keme called softly, "you and your nephew should leave. This isn't your fight." Tom shook his head. "With respect, it became my fight when Miller started throwing his weight around in our town. Besides, someone needs to witness whatever happens here." The riders stopped at a cautious distance from the cabin. Charles Miller surveyed the property with obvious distaste before calling out in a cultured Boston accent. "I know you're in there, Sarah. This childish game has gone on long enough. Come out now, and we can avoid unnecessary unpleasantness." Sarah's knuckles whitened around her rifle, but she remained silent. "Mr. Keme," Charles continued when no response came, "I have legal documents declaring my wife mentally unfit and authorizing her return to my care. I also have a warrant for your arrest for kidnapping. Surrender her now, and the sheriff may show leniency." The sheriff looked distinctly uncomfortable at being mentioned. "Now, Mr. Miller," he began, "we agreed this would be a peaceful—" "Sheriff," Charles cut him off sharply, "execute your warrant or step aside for men who will." Keme met Sarah's eyes across the room, silently confirming their plan. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as family. "Mr. Miller," Keme called through the window, his voice steady and carrying, "perhaps you should see this before making threats." He held up the marriage certificate, clearly visible even at a distance. "Your former wife is now legally married to me. She is Sarah Keme now, not Sarah Miller." The stunned silence that followed was broken by Charles Miller's cold, incredulous laughter. "You can't be serious. A marriage to a savage won't stand in any court in this country." "It will in territorial court," the sheriff corrected reluctantly, "if it's properly registered." "Which it is," Keme confirmed. "Ask the minister in town." Charles Miller's composure cracked for the first time, his aristocratic features contorting with rage. He pulled an ornate gold pocket watch from his vest, a symbol of his wealth and status that seemed absurdly out of place in the rugged frontier landscape. "You have 1 hour," he announced, checking the watch with exaggerated precision. "1 hour to reconsider this charade. Then we will enter that cabin and execute our legal authority." Keme remained silent, recognizing the threat for what it was. Charles Miller was not a man accustomed to being denied. As the standoff continued, Sarah moved to Keme's side, deliberately making herself visible in the window. "He's bluffing about the legal documents," she said quietly. "He can't have obtained a territorial commitment order without my presence or testimony from local doctors." Keme nodded slightly. "Sheriff knows that too. See how he hangs back." "Charles will try to provoke you," Sarah warned. "Make you appear dangerous or unstable. It's how he operates, manipulating situations to get what he wants." From outside, Charles called again. "Sarah, be reasonable. This primitive life isn't suitable for a woman of your breeding. Think of your family's reputation." "My family knows what you are," Sarah responded, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "My sister has copies of my physician's reports documenting your abuse." Charles's jaw tightened visibly. He turned to his secretary, speaking in low tones that didn't reach the cabin. The secretary nodded and rode back toward town with one of the hired guns. "He's sending for reinforcements," Tom observed grimly. "Or creating a story to justify force," Keme suggested. "Sheriff won't act without cause." Inside the cabin, they continued preparations. Keme and Tom barricaded the door while Sarah and Tom's nephew gathered additional ammunition and supplies. The cabin's thick log walls would provide good protection, but they were outnumbered and potentially outgunned. "There's another option," Keme said to Sarah when they had a moment alone. "The hunting cabin I showed you in my maps. You could slip out the back while I keep them occupied here." Sarah's expression hardened. "I'm not running, Keme. Not anymore." "Not running," he corrected. "Tactical retreat. Live to fight another day." She shook her head firmly. "If I leave, Charles will claim it proves I'm being held against my will. He'll either kill you or have you imprisoned." Her hand found his. "We stand together." Outside, the hour was passing slowly. Charles remained mounted, occasionally checking his gold watch with theatrical impatience. His remaining men had spread out, taking positions that would allow them to surround the cabin when the time came. "He always uses that watch to intimidate," Sarah observed bitterly. "In Boston, he would place it on the table during disagreements, timing how long I had to reconsider my unreasonable positions." Tom kept watch at the front window. "Sheriff's getting nervous," he reported. "Keeps looking back toward town." Keme joined him, assessing the situation. "He doesn't want bloodshed. Neither do we." He turned to Sarah. "I have an idea, but it's risky." "I'm listening," she said. "We invite the sheriff in. Alone. Show him our marriage certificate. Have him witness that you're here willingly." Keme's plan formed as he spoke. "If he officially acknowledges you're not being held against your will, Miller loses his legal pretense." Sarah considered this. "Charles won't give up easily. He hates losing more than he ever loved me." "But it would put the sheriff firmly on record," Tom pointed out. "Hard for him to justify action against you after that." After a brief discussion, they agreed to try. Keme called out to the sheriff, inviting him, and him alone, to enter under flag of truce. Charles immediately objected, but the sheriff, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation, agreed. The tension was palpable as the sheriff entered cautiously, hands visible to show he meant no harm. Inside, he removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Sarah. "Mrs. Miller? Or I suppose it's Mrs. Keme now?" "It is," Sarah confirmed, showing him the marriage certificate. "We were legally married by Reverend Johnson in Cimarron Springs. The documentation has been filed with the county clerk." The sheriff examined the certificate, then looked between Sarah and Keme. "And you're here of your own free will, ma'am? Not under any duress or coercion?" "I am here by choice, Sheriff," Sarah stated firmly. "Charles Miller is my former husband. During our marriage, he subjected me to persistent physical and mental abuse." She held his gaze steadily. "I left him to save my life, and I have built a new one here with my husband." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Miller has documentation claiming you're unwell, not of sound mind." "Fabricated," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Charles controls doctors in Boston through his family's hospital donations. He's done this before, had me committed when I previously attempted to leave him." Tom stepped forward. "Sheriff, you've known me for 15 years. I'm vouching for Mrs. Keme's mental soundness and confirming she's here willingly." The sheriff sighed heavily, replacing his hat. "This puts me in a difficult position. Judge Parker has considerable influence in the territory. But the law is the law," Keme stated quietly. "And Sarah is my legal wife here by choice." After a moment's consideration, the sheriff nodded. "I'll inform Mr. Miller that I find no evidence of kidnapping or coercion. Without that, his commitment order, if he even has one, won't stand in territorial court." When the sheriff stepped back outside to deliver his findings, Charles Miller's reaction was immediate and explosive. Even through the cabin walls, they could hear his voice rising in outrage, demanding the sheriff fulfill his duty. "He won't accept this," Sarah said, watching through the window. "Not ever." "No," Keme agreed grimly. "But now he'll have to show his true nature." Sure enough, Charles's next words confirmed their assessment. "If the law won't recover my wife," he shouted, loud enough for them to hear clearly, "then I'll handle this matter privately." He turned to his hired guns. $500 to any man who brings her out alive. Do whatever is necessary with the others. The sheriff, to his credit, attempted to intervene. "Now see here, Miller, I can't allow you to." "You've made your position clear, Sheriff." Charles cut him off coldly. "Now step aside and allow me to resolve a personal matter. Unless you intend to arrest me for retrieving my own property." "She's not property," the sheriff objected. But his authority was clearly waning against Charles's wealth and determination. Inside the cabin, Keme quickly assessed their options. "Tom, take your nephew and the sheriff back to town. Get help." Tom hesitated. "Leaving you outnumbered." "We need witnesses alive," Keme insisted. "And reinforcements if possible." After a brief argument, Tom reluctantly agreed, slipping out the back with his nephew while Charles was still berating the sheriff. Keme hoped they would reach town safely and return with help, but he wasn't counting on it. This confrontation would likely be resolved before reinforcements could arrive. "Sarah, take position in the bedroom," Keme directed. "Better cover there, and they won't expect two firing positions." Sarah moved to comply, but paused to pull Keme into a fierce embrace. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "these months with you have been worth everything." Keme held her briefly, allowing himself this moment of connection before they faced what was coming. "Keep low. Shoot only if necessary." Outside, the sheriff made one final attempt to maintain order. "Miller, you're talking about assault and potentially murder. I can't let that happen." "Then arrest me," Charles challenged, knowing the sheriff lacked the political will to act against a man of his standing without clear cause. When the sheriff hesitated, Charles turned to his hired guns. "Gentlemen, proceed." Two of the men dismounted and approached the cabin, weapons ready. The sheriff, faced with imminent violence, made his choice. "Stop right there," he ordered, drawing his own weapon. "I'm placing you all under arrest for attempted assault." One of the hired guns turned, faster than seemed possible, and fired. The sheriff crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg where the bullet had struck. Charles appeared momentarily stunned by this escalation but quickly recovered. "Regrettable but necessary," he declared. The man was overstepping his authority. Keme had seen enough. He fired a warning shot into the ground near the approaching men. "That's far enough," he called. "Next one won't miss." The hired guns immediately took cover, professionals recognizing the serious intent behind the warning. Charles, however, seemed almost pleased by the development. "You see?" he called to no one in particular. "The savage is violent, just as I claimed. Clearly my wife is being held against her will by a dangerous man." Inside, Keme moved quickly between windows, giving the impression of multiple defenders. He knew they were in a precarious position. The cabin was defensible, but they were outnumbered and couldn't hold out indefinitely. In the bedroom, Sarah kept watch through a small window, rifle ready. When she spotted movement along the tree line to the east, one of the hired guns attempting to circle behind the cabin, she took careful aim as Keme had taught her and fired. The man yelled in pain, dropping his weapon and clutching his shoulder. "Good shot," Keme called approvingly. "I was aiming for his chest," Sarah admitted. "But I'll take it." The exchange of gunfire continued sporadically for nearly an hour, neither side gaining a clear advantage. The hired guns were cautious, professional enough to avoid unnecessary risks. Keme and Sarah were disciplined, conserving ammunition and firing only when they had clear targets. As dusk approached, Charles's frustration grew visible. "This is taking too long," they heard him complain to his secretary. "We need to smoke them out." Keme tensed at these words. Fire was the one threat the cabin couldn't withstand. "Sarah," he called softly, "we need to leave. Now." She joined him quickly, understanding the urgency. The back door. Keme shook his head. They'll be watching it. We used the tunnel. Years earlier, Keme had dug a narrow escape tunnel from the cabin's root cellar, concealing its entrance beneath storage shelves. He'd created it during his most paranoid years, when he still expected the army to return and finish what they'd started with his people. He'd never imagined it would one day save not just his life, but that of a Boston-born wife he'd come to cherish. They gathered essential supplies quickly: water, ammunition, Keme's medicine pouch, Sarah's journal. As they prepared to descend into the cellar, Keme spotted the leather restraints Charles's men had brought to bind Sarah once captured. He broke them deliberately, leaving the pieces visible near the back door, a sign of resistance and escape. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to crawl in places. Sarah moved forward without complaint, though Keme knew the confined space must be terrifying for her. When they emerged 100 yards from the cabin, hidden by a stand of junipers, the first smoke was already visible rising from the cabin's roof. "They're burning our home," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Just wood," Keme reminded her, though he felt the loss deeply himself. "We're still free." They crept away from the homestead, using the growing darkness as cover. Keme led them not toward town, where Charles would surely have men watching, but up into the mountains where his Apache skills would give them the advantage. As they reached the ridge overlooking the property, they paused to catch their breath. Below, flames engulfed the cabin that had been their sanctuary. Around it, dark figures moved like shadows, Charles's men searching for signs of their escape. Sarah clutched Keme's hand tightly. "What now?" "Now," Keme said, determination hardening his voice. "We stop running and start fighting back." Dawn found Keme and Sarah in the small hunting cabin hidden in the box canyon. They had traveled through the night, following game trails and creek beds to obscure their tracks. Though exhausted, they took turns keeping watch while the other rested. "They'll track us here eventually," Keme said as he checked their limited ammunition. "Charles won't give up." Sarah nodded, her face showing fatigue but not defeat. "Then we need to change the terms of this confrontation. Make him fight on our ground, not his." Keme looked at her with newfound respect. She was thinking like a strategist now, not a victim. "What do you suggest?" "Charles expects us to keep running or hiding," Sarah said, her mind working through the problem. "What he doesn't expect is for us to return to town." The plan they developed was bold, perhaps reckless, but offered their best chance. While Charles and his men combed the mountains, they would double back to Cimarron Springs. There, in public, with witnesses, they would expose Charles's actions and seek the community's protection. They waited until midday before setting out, calculating that Charles's search parties would be deep in the wilderness by then. The journey was grueling, taking indirect routes, moving carefully to avoid leaving signs of their passage. By dusk, they had reached the outskirts of town. "Wait here," Keme instructed, finding Sarah a concealed position in a stand of cottonwoods. "I'll make sure it's safe." He approached town cautiously, using the gathering darkness as cover. What he saw confirmed their suspicions. 2 of Charles's hired guns stationed at the main street entrance, watching for their possible return. When Keme rejoined Sarah, he shared his observations. "We need a distraction to get past them." Sarah thought for a moment, then reached into her pocket and withdrew Charles's gun, a pearl-handled revolver she had taken from one of his men during their escape from the burning cabin. "Use this," she suggested. "If they hear shots from the north, they'll investigate, thinking it's us." Keme took the ornate weapon, examining it briefly. Good thinking. The distraction worked perfectly. While Keme fired 2 shots from a distant ridge, drawing the attention of Charles's men, Sarah slipped into town through the livery stable at the southern end. Keme rejoined her minutes later, and together they made their way to Tom Holloway's store. Tom's relief at seeing them alive was palpable. "Sheriff's wounded but recovering," he informed them quickly. Town's divided. Some folks sympathize with your situation. Others are intimidated by Miller's money and connections. We need to address everyone publicly, Sarah explained their plan. Force Charles to face the community's judgment, not just ours. Tom looked doubtful. Miller's at Judge Parker's house now, planning his next move. Getting him to a public confrontation won't be easy. Then we bring the public to him, Keme suggested. Word spread quickly through town. The Apache scout and his Boston bride had returned and were calling for justice. Despite Charles's attempts to portray them as fugitives, curiosity and the frontier sense of fair play brought people to the street outside Judge Parker's home. As the crowd gathered, Sarah stood on the boardwalk, her voice clear and carrying. My name is Sarah Keme, formerly Sarah Miller of Boston. I am here of my own free will, legally married, and seeking the protection of this community against the man who abused me for years and now seeks to reclaim me by force. The town's reaction was mixed, murmurs of sympathy alongside skeptical whispers. But the crowd continued to grow, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Inside the judge's house, Charles was furious. This is absurd, he snapped at his secretary. I will not be summoned like a common criminal by my own runaway wife and her savage companion. Judge Parker, a political animal sensitive to public opinion, frowned at the growing crowd outside his window. Mr. Miller, I think you should address these allegations. The community is watching. Charles paced, calculating his options. Finally, his ambition overrode his pride. After all, he had political aspirations back east, and a scandal in a frontier town could follow him home if not properly managed. When Charles emerged onto the porch, his expression was one of pained concern rather than anger. My dear Sarah, he called, loud enough for all to hear. I've been so worried about your condition. The doctors warned that your delusions might worsen without proper care. Sarah stood her ground, Keme beside her. There are no delusions, Charles. Only the truth you've tried to bury with your money and influence. Charles descended the steps, approaching with a solicitous expression that didn't reach his eyes. Everyone can see you're not well, he said smoothly. These accusations, this bizarre arrangement with a local guide. He almost stumbled over the euphemism, clearly restraining less polite terms for Keme. It's all symptomatic of your condition. The crowd watched the exchange with growing interest. Charles was playing his part perfectly, the concerned husband seeking his troubled wife. But Sarah refused to be cast as the hysteric. Would a delusional woman have these? She asked, producing a small packet of physicians' reports documenting her injuries over the years. She handed them to the town doctor, who had joined the gathering. Or these. She displayed letters from her sister corroborating the abuse. Charles's mask slipped momentarily, anger flashing in his eyes before he recovered. Forgeries, he declared, or misunderstandings. Accidents exaggerated by an unwell mind. And this. Sarah rolled up her sleeve to reveal faded but still visible bruises in the shape of fingerprints. Another accident, Charles? The crowd's murmurs grew more hostile toward Charles. He sensed the shift and changed tactics, addressing the men directly. Gentlemen, surely you understand a husband's right to manage his household as he sees fit, he appealed. The law recognizes my authority over my wife's person and property. Former wife, Keme corrected, speaking for the first time. Sarah is legally married to me now. Charles's control finally broke. A marriage to an Apache half-breed means nothing, he snarled. No court in Boston would recognize such a union. We're not in Boston, the town doctor observed quietly, looking up from the medical reports he'd been examining. And these injuries are consistent with repeated physical abuse, not accidents. Charles Miller was not accustomed to losing control of a situation. His face flushed with anger as he saw the crowd's sympathies shifting away from him. His carefully constructed image as the concerned husband was crumbling with each piece of evidence Sarah presented. "This is preposterous," he declared, turning to Judge Parker. "Are territorial courts now recognizing the testimony of women over their husbands? Of savages over gentlemen?" The judge, sensing which way the wind was blowing, stepped back slightly. "The law is the law, Mr. Miller. If Mrs. Keme has evidence of abuse and is legally married, she is my wife," Charles shouted, his composed facade finally shattering completely. He lunged toward Sarah, grabbing her arm roughly. "You are coming home where you belong." Keme moved instantly, breaking Charles's grip and positioning himself between them. The crowd tensed, many reaching for weapons. "Don't touch her again," Keme warned, his voice deadly quiet. Charles sneered. "Or what? Will you scalp me, Indian? Prove exactly what kind of animal you are." The racial slur rippled through the crowd, causing many to step back. But others, including Tom Holloway and several townspeople who had come to know Keme over the years, moved closer in support. "Keme has never been anything but honorable," Tom stated firmly. "More than I can say for a man who shoots sheriffs and burns homesteads." Charles's eyes narrowed. "You have no proof of such wild accusations." "I witnessed it," called a voice from the back of the crowd. The wounded sheriff limped forward, supported by his deputy. "Mr. Miller ordered his men to fire on me and to burn the Keme homestead when legal means failed him." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more condemning. Charles glanced at his hired guns, who were eyeing the increasingly hostile gathering with professional wariness. Even they seemed unwilling to start a gunfight against an entire town. Desperate and cornered, Charles made his final play. "This woman is my property by law," he insisted, pulling papers from his coat. "I have documents from Boston." "Courts, which have no jurisdiction here," interrupted a new voice. A territorial judge who had been visiting Cimarron Springs stepped forward. "I've reviewed the marriage certificate between Sarah and Keme. It is legal and binding in this territory." Charles looked around wildly, seeing his control of the situation slipping away. With shocking suddenness, he drew a hidden derringer from his sleeve and pointed it directly at Sarah. "If I can't have her, no one will," he snarled. Several things happened at once. Keme lunged toward Charles. Sarah dove to the side. A shot rang out, but not from Charles's weapon. Charles staggered backward, dropping his derringer unfired as blood bloomed on his shoulder. Behind him, his secretary stood with a smoking pistol. "Enough, Charles," the man said shakily. "I won't be party to murder." The betrayal from his most loyal employee seemed to break something in Charles Miller. He sank to his knees, his aristocratic bearing collapsing into something smaller and pathetic. "You're finished in Boston." He spat at Sarah as the town doctor moved to tend his wound. "Your reputation is ruined." Sarah straightened, standing tall beside Keme. "I don't live in Boston anymore," she replied simply. "I'm home." 1 year later, spring brought new life to the rebuilt Keme homestead. The cabin, larger now with a proper second bedroom, stood where the original had burned. A vegetable garden flourished under Sarah's care, and fruit trees, purchased with the money from selling her silver hairbrush, were taking root on the western slope. On the porch, Keme sat carving a small wooden horse while Sarah read aloud from a book of poetry. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the arrival of 2 visitors, Tom Holloway and a young boy of mixed heritage, perhaps 10 years old. "Found him hiding in my storeroom," Tom explained. "Parents killed in a raid north of here. Apache mother, white father. Nobody in town would take him in." The boy stood silently, eyes downcast, expecting rejection. Sarah and Keme exchanged a glance, an entire conversation passing between them without words. Keme rose and approached the boy, kneeling to meet his eyes. "What is your name?" he asked gently in Apache. The boy looked up in surprise at hearing his mother's language. "Daniel," he answered, "but my mother called me Tanito." "Tanito," Keme repeated, nodding. "It means sunshine." A good name. Sarah joined them, her expression warm. Are you hungry, Tanito? I've made stew. The boy's suspicious expression softened slightly at the kindness in her voice. He nodded. That evening, as Tanito slept in what had been the spare bedroom, Sarah and Keme sat before the fire, contemplating the unexpected turn their lives had taken. Charles's final revenge, Sarah mused. He ensured I could never have children of my own. Yet here we are, Keme responded, taking her hand. With a son nonetheless. Sarah smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. The first of many, perhaps? There are other children who need homes. A family built by choice, not blood, Keme agreed. Like my people have always done. Outside, the gray wolf that had watched over their homestead for years approached closer than ever before, sensing the change in the household. Through the window, Tanito spotted the animal and sat up in bed, eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. The next morning, Sarah received a letter from Philadelphia. Her sister wrote that Charles Miller had died from complications related to his wound, his final months spent in bitter isolation as former friends distanced themselves from his increasingly erratic behavior. Are you all right? Keme asked, seeing her expression as she read the news. Yes, Sarah answered truthfully. I feel nothing for him now. Not hate, not relief, just nothing. She folded the letter carefully. My life is here. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a new family portrait. A tintype photographer passing through town had captured the three of them together. Beside it, in silent witness to the journey that had brought them to this moment, stood the small wooden cradle Keme had carved for his first daughter so many years ago. Later that day, as Keme taught Tanito to fish in the creek, Sarah watched from the bank, her journal open on her lap. She wrote not of the past, but of the future they were building. A family created from loss and love, stronger for having been chosen rather than merely born. This is what freedom feels like, she wrote, looking up to see Keme and Tanito laughing together as they landed a small trout. Not the absence of bonds, but the presence of the right ones.